The air above the Strait of Malacca sat heavy and still, thick with the kind of heat that makes men sluggish, that slows the mind and softens the focus. It was the sort of heat that whispers to a soldier to sit down, to wait, to take a breath. But Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reef Calloway did not sit. He had not sat in 11 hours. He had not eaten in 9. He had barely blinked in 6. He lay beneath the surface of the greenish-brown water like something that had always been there, like a root, like a stone, like a creature born from the deep with no interest in the world above. The only thing that moved was the slow rise and fall of his chest behind the closed-circuit rebreather strap to his body, a device that produced no bubbles, made no sound, left no trace of his presence. The water above him moved in lazy currents. Small fish darted past. A plastic bag floated by. And Marcus Calloway waited, though he had been inserted from a submarine 12 nautical miles out. The swim-in had taken 3 hours, all of it conducted at night, all of it done alone. The mission briefing had been short. The intelligence had been specific. A cell of armed pirates operating under the umbrella of a larger criminal network had seized a cargo vessel, the MV Priya Start, 2 days earlier. The ship had 41 crew members aboard, mostly Filipino nationals, along with a handful of Malaysian and Indonesian men. The pirates were not amateurs. They were organized, well-armed, and according to signals intelligence gathered over 72 hours, they were expecting a response. They had posted lookouts. They had established communication protocols. They had sentinels with night vision equipment rotating every 4 hours. They had done, in short, everything right. Everything except account for someone like Marcus Calloway. Back at the Joint Operations Center in Singapore, the mission planners had gone over every variable. They had studied satellite imagery. They had mapped guard rotations. They had cross-referenced vessel schematics with the thermal signatures captured by an overhead drone. They had considered a helicopter assault, a surface approach, a coordinated entry from multiple sides. They had rejected each option in turn. A helicopter approach gave away the element of surprise. A surface approach risked casualties among the hostages. A coordinated multi-team entry required more preparation time than the intelligence window allowed. What they needed was silence. What they needed was one man in the water, invisible and patient, capable of doing in darkness what a platoon could not do in daylight. They had put Marcus's photograph on the planning board and drawn a circle around his face with a red marker. Marcus had been called Reef since his first deployment to the Philippines 8 years ago, when a fellow operator had watched him disappear into a reef system for 6 hours during a reconnaissance mission and emerge on the other side without a scratch, without a sound, and without a single hostile having any idea he had been there. The name had stuck. In the teams, nicknames always did. But the name had grown beyond a simple handle. It had become a kind of legend. Men who had worked with him spoke about it in the careful, understated way that operators speak about things that genuinely impress them, which is to say, they almost never spoke about it at all, but when they did, they chose their words with unusual precision. They said things like, "He becomes the water." They said, "You forget he's a person." They said, "There's something wrong with him," and they meant it as the highest compliment a SEAL can offer another. He had grown up in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a small house 3 blocks from the water. His father had been a commercial fisherman. His grandfather had been one too. Marcus had spent his childhood in boats, in rivers, in tidal marshes, in the Atlantic itself. He had learned to read water the way other children learn to read books, not as information to be memorized, but as a language to be felt. He knew what a particular current meant. He knew where a channel ran deep by the way the surface moved above it. He knew, without being able to fully explain how, when the water around him changed character, when something had disturbed it, when something was wrong. This was not mysticism. It was years of accumulated experience, a sensitivity built through repetition and attention. The way a musician eventually stops reading notes and simply hears the music. He had joined the Navy at 18, gone through basic underwater demolition training at 19, and been selected for SEAL Team 3 at 22. By the time he was 26, he had completed 4 deployments, 2 in the Middle East, 1 in West Africa, 1 in Southeast Asia. He had been awarded a Silver Star for actions in the Sulu Sea that his citation described in the careful, bureaucratic language of military commendations. The kind of language that drains the blood from a story and leaves only the skeleton. What the citation did not describe was the 12 hours he had spent in the water with a fractured wrist, a compromised oxygen supply, and for enemy fighters searching the shoreline within 200 meters of his position. What it did not describe was how he had stayed completely still for 4 of those hours as one of the searchers sat on a rock directly above the water he was hiding in and smoked 3 cigarettes. What it did not describe was the particular quality of stillness required to survive that moment. Not just physical stillness, but mental stillness. The kind that comes from going somewhere inside yourself that fear cannot reach. Now, at 34. Marcus Calloway was considered by many in the special operations community to be the finest combat swimmer alive. He did not dispute this. He did not confirm it either. He had very little interest in the assessment of others. What he had was a mission, a set of objectives, a vessel schematic memorized to the point of reflex, and 11 hours of patience already logged in a shallow anchorage off an island that did not appear on most commercial maps. The MV Priya Star sat at anchor to 100 meters northeast of his position. He had approached it from the south, using a subsurface navigation board and a compass, checking his position every 30 minutes against landmarks he had memorized from the satellite imagery. He could see the vessel now in the way that a man underwater can see things above the surface, distorted, shimmering, broken up by light and movement, but recognizable. He could see the dark mass of the hull. He could see the anchor chain descending into the murk. He could see, faintly, the movement of boots on the deck above the waterline. The patrol rotation that his intelligence said happened every 45 minutes. He had one primary objective and 2 contingency tasks. The primary objective was intelligence collection. He was to get close enough to the vessel to deploy a series of acoustic sensors along the hull that would allow the operations center to monitor communications inside the ship. The contingency tasks were, in the careful language of the mission brief, kinetic in nature. This meant that if circumstances changed, if a hostage appeared to be in immediate danger, if the situation escalated beyond the parameters established by the planners, Marcus was authorized to act. He had a Suppressig Sauer P226 in a waterproof holster on his right thigh. He had a serrated dive knife on his left forearm. He had 4 sensors in a waterproof pouch on his back. He had a radio sealed inside a dry bag against his chest, tuned to the operations frequency. And he had that quality, the one the men in the teams talked about in their understated way, that thing that made him become the water dot at 0:1 to local time. He began to move. He pulled himself through the water in long, slow strokes, using a flutter kick so minimal it barely disturbed the surface, keeping his profile horizontal and low. He moved the way a ray moves along the bottom, not fast, not slow, but continuously, without urgency, without hesitation. As though movement itself was his natural state, and stopping would require special effort. He covered the 200 meters in 19 minutes. The anchor chain was a thick, rusted link running from the ship's bow down into the sediment. Marcus wrapped one hand around it and held himself against the current, breathing slowly, listening. Above him, on the deck of the Priya Star, he could hear the shuffle of footsteps. He could hear a voice, a low murmur in Tagalog, which he recognized without understanding. He could hear the creak of the vessel's hull against the anchor chain, the sound of the sea moving against steel. He pressed himself flat against the hull just below the waterline and began to move along it toward the stern, placing the sensors at intervals the mission brief had specified. Each sensor was roughly the size and shape of a thick coin. Each one had a magnetic backing that adhered to the steel hull without sound. He placed the first one, then the second. He was placing the third when he heard something that did not belong. It was a sound above the waterline, not footsteps, not voices. It was the sound of a hatch being opened. Then a voice, louder than the others, speaking in a language he identified after a moment as a Filipino dialect mixed with something else, something harder, more clipped. And then unmistakably, the sound of a woman crying. Marcus went completely still. His hand rested on the hull. His breathing slowed to almost nothing. In the operations center 37 kilometers away, the mission controller watching the drone feed leaned forward in his chair. Because the acoustic sensors Marcus had already placed had just started transmitting. And what they were transmitting had changed everything. The mission brief had said 41 crew. The woman's name was Dr. Emilia Soriano. She was 31 years old, a marine biologist from the University of the Philippines, Visayas. And she had been aboard the MV Priya Star, not as a crew member, but as a passenger, a researcher catching a working vessel passage to a research station in the Celebes Sea. A common enough arrangement in that part of the world, where budget constraints and professional networks often meant scientists traveled by whatever means were available. Her name had not appeared in the shipping manifest provided to the operations center because the ship's captain had not filed an updated passenger log before the pirates boarded. She had been in a small storage cabin near the stern when the attack happened. She had stayed there, hidden behind a false panel that one of the Filipino crew members had shown her in the first frantic minutes of the seizure. She had been there for 40 hours. None of this information had been available to the mission planners. None of it had appeared in the intelligence picture. The first time anyone outside the Priya Star became aware that Dr. Soriano existed was the moment she was discovered. A pirate named Datu, a thick-necked man with a beard going gray at the edges and a Chinese-made rifle slung across his chest, had been searching the stern compartments, looking for cargo manifests when he had found the hidden panel. He had not been gentle about it. The sound Marcus had heard through the hull was the sound of Datu pulling Dr. Soriano out of the hidden space by her arm and demanding, in a mixture of dialects and broken English, that she explain who she was and what she was doing. The woman's crying, which Marcus had heard so clearly in the water below, was not panic. It was anger. It was the crying of a person who had spent 40 hours controlling their fear and had, in one rough moment, run out of patience for doing so. In the operations center, the mission controller, a Navy commander named Walsh, was processing the new information quickly. He had 4 assets available. Marcus in the water, a maritime security response team staged on a fast boat for nautical miles to the south, a second SEAL element aboard a helicopter orbiting at low altitude 8 miles out on a 15-minute call-out, and a drone overhead with a full sensor package that was currently tracking the thermal signature of Datu and Dr. Soriano moving along the port side deck toward the ship's main cabin. Walsh keyed his radio and gave Marcus a situation update in precise, compressed language, the kind of language that operators use when every word costs time and time costs lives. He told Marcus about the woman. He told Marcus her location. He told Marcus that Datu was armed, that there were 3 other armed men topside, and that the remaining crew were being held in the ship's cargo hold. Then he said what he had to say. The decision was Marcus's. This was not unusual in special operations. The man on the ground, or in this case, in the water, always has information the planners do not. He has the smell of the air and the sound of the sea. He has the feel of the moment, the texture of the specific circumstance. Walsh trusted Marcus the way you trust a tool you have used for years and have never known to fail. He trusted him the way a surgeon trusts his own hands. He said the decision was Marcus's, and then he stopped talking because there was nothing more useful he could say. Marcus processed it. He was still below the waterline, pressed flat against the hull in the dark water, the ship steel warm against his palm from the sun it had absorbed during the day. He could feel the vibration of the generator running somewhere in the vessel's belly. He could feel, through the hull, the footsteps of the man called Datu moving along the deck above. He could hear, faintly distorted by the water, the sound of voices. He placed the 4th sensor. He had completed his primary objective. That part was done. Everything now was contingency. He moved aft. The Priya Star had a boarding ladder on the port quarter, a steel-rung ladder bolted to the hull that descended to within 2 meters of the waterline, used for pilot boarding when the vessel was underway. He had noted it in the schematics. He had noted it because a man who spends his professional life thinking about how to get onto things always notes the boarding ladder. He reached it. He took one breath, then another. He was calibrating himself the way a precision instrument calibrates before use, going through an internal checklist, checking every system, confirming readiness. His heart rate was at 51 beats per minute. He knew this without looking at anything. He knew his own body the way he knew water. He began to climb. The deck of the Priya Star at 0231 local time was lit by a single working floodlight near the bow and by the ambient glow of a half-moon sitting low on the horizon. There were shadows everywhere, behind equipment housings, between containers, along the walkways that ran the perimeter of the deck. Marcus came over the rail and into the first shadow in a single fluid movement that took less than 2 seconds and made no sound that could be distinguished from the ordinary noise of the sea. He pressed himself flat against the exterior of the superstructure and scanned. He saw 2 of the 3 topside sentinels within the first 8 seconds, one near the bow, one amidships. He did not yet see the third. The absence of the third was a problem he filed away and kept scanning for. Datu and Dr. Soriano had gone inside the main cabin. He could see the light through the cabin's porthole windows. He moved along the superstructure toward the cabin. He moved the way water moves through a narrow channel, finding the path of least resistance, filling space without forcing it, never stopping but never rushing. 11 years of doing this had stripped away everything superfluous. There was no theater in it, no drama. It was simply the most efficient way to move from one place to another without being seen, and Marcus had practiced it enough that efficiency had become instinct. He reached the cabin door. He checked the third sentinel's last known position, starboard side, near the lifeboat davit, and confirmed the man had not moved. He turned his attention to the door. He could hear Datu's voice through it. The man was calmer now. His tone had shifted from interrogation to something more calculated. This was, in some ways, worse. A man who is shouting is emotional. A man who has calmed down and become calculating is something else. Marcus did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He had heard it before, in other places, in other situations that had ended badly when someone was not there in time to prevent that. He put his hand on the door handle. He checked the positioning of the sentinels one more time in his head. Bow, amidships, lifeboat davit. He took a breath. He opened the door. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something that Marcus would later describe in his after-action report with the clipped, factual precision that military reporting demands. The report would note contact times, engagement distances, the disposition of each subject, the actions taken, and their outcomes. It would be accurate in every particular. It would also, in the way that all such reports are, be entirely unable to convey what those 4 minutes were actually like. It could not convey the specific quality of light inside the cabin. The single overhead bulb casting hard shadows across the faces of 4 men who had not expected anyone to come through that door from the water. It could not convey the fraction of a second in which Datu's face shifted from confidence to confusion to something that had no clean English word for it. The expression of a man who has, in an instant, understood something he cannot fully process. Datu was the first problem. He was standing 3 meters inside the cabin, his rifle pointed at Dr. Soriano, who was seated on a bolted-down chair with her hands on the table in front of her. There were 2 other men in the cabin, one near the far wall, one seated at a navigation console. Marcus neutralized Datu with the SIG before the man had completed his turn toward the door. The sound was minimal. The suppressed shot sounded roughly like a book dropped onto a hard floor. The man near the far wall was moving toward his weapon. Marcus covered the distance into steps and took him down with the knife before he reached it. The seated man at the console had frozen. Marcus secured him quickly, using a flex cuff from his vest. The entire sequence had taken 11 seconds from the moment the door opened. Dr. Amelia Soriano sat completely still through all of it. She had her hands flat on the table. She was watching Marcus with an expression that he would later describe, in the flat language of his report, as cooperative. What it actually was, in the moment, was something more complicated than that. She was a scientist who had spent 40 hours in a hidden compartment running probability calculations in her head. And in the past 11 seconds she had watched probability shift, violently and completely, in her direction. She was not in shock. She was, by her own account given in a debrief 3 days later, extremely focused. She looked at Marcus Calloway, soaking wet, face covered in neoprene, dripping dark water onto the cabin floor, and she said, in clear and precise English, "I knew someone would come. I just did not know they would come from the sea."